Good evening. Welcome to our weekly Nitzutzos, sparks of the Parsha, tidbits of commentary on various parts of the weekly Torah portion. This week, we're reading the portion of Pinchas. Pinchas was the grandson of Aaron, great nephew of Moses, and the end of last week's Parsha left off with Pinchas executing, both senses of the word, a very bold move where he spears a leading Jewish prince whose name was Zimri and a Midianite princess whose name was Cosbi as they were consorting. And as a result of the immorality that the events that surrounded that whole liaison occurred, 24,000 people died in a plague. As soon as Pinchas did this act of heroism, the act of zealotry, that's when the plague stopped. And that's where last week's portion ends. It ends on the very words that Pinchas commits this act. He kills these two people, and the plague ceased. And the dead in this plague were 24,000. So we know that Pinchas is the one who stopped the plague. And I'm mentioning that because many people, when they read the Torah, and it's true about other texts as well, but especially about the Torah, and everyone finds a favorite verse or a favorite act of a person that they either like or don't like. Most of the time it's what they don't like. And that's how they define that person. So Pinchas is sometimes viewed in a very negative light. What is Pinchas? A zealot. Zealots are no good, of course. Zealots are fanatics, are extremists. And what do we see? He kills two people. But if you take the text and you accept that the text is telling you the truth, which is of course the case when it's the Torah, then we know that Pinchas's act saved thousands upon thousands of lives that would have perished if the plague would have continued. So Pinchas was a hero. But you don't really know that Pinchas was a hero until you begin reading this week's portion, where God himself tells Pinchas, or describes Pinchas's act as an act that removed God's anger from the Jewish people, and I did not destroy the children of Israel because of my anger, because of my vengeance. And that's why he should be told that I am giving him the Peace Prize, not the Nobel Peace Prize, but the Kohen Peace Prize, named after not Mr. Noble, but after the fact that Pinchas was awarded the distinction of being a Kohen. And of course, people will say, but if your father is a Kohen and your grandfather was a Kohen, then you're a Kohen. No, that is not necessarily true, although the joke seems to have suggested that that's the case. When Aaron and his sons, 4 sons, were anointed to be Kohen, only they and their children, Pinchas, who was alive at that time, was not anointed. So he was not going to be another line of priests. He was going to belong to the rest of the tribe of Levi and be a Levite. Also an important family within the Jewish collective family. But he was not expected to be a Kohen. Because he did this act of zealousness, of violence, he was given the covenant of peace. In other words, he was considered to be a man of peace, and he was given the role of a Kohen. And what is a Kohen's role? To bring peace between God and Israel. He's the one who offers the sacrifices which cements the relationship between God and the Jewish people. So Pinchas really rates very high in Jewish tradition. However, there's always a however. Having said that, there is also a caveat here, and that's what I'm going to discuss by focusing on the very opening verse, the second verse of the Parsha, where it says, Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron, the Kohen, turned back my wrath from upon the children of Israel. So Rashi asks the question, or addresses the question, why is it important for the Torah to tell us who Pinchas was? If you turn back just one page to the end of last week's portion, when it introduces Pinchas, it says in chapter 24, verse 7, Pinchas, son of Elazar, son of Aaron, the Kohen, saw what happened and he reacted to it. So we already know that Pinchas was the son of Elazar, who was also the son of Aaron. Elazar was the son of Aaron. Why does the Torah have to repeat this? So Rashi says because Pinchas was harshly condemned by other Jews. And they told him that, look what he did. And they insulted him by his ancestry. He was a grandson of a man called Putiel. Putiel is another name for Jethro, who was a pagan priest before he was introduced to Judaism and became a convert to Judaism. But before that, he was a pagan priest. And one of his 7 names was Putiel. Why did he have 7 names? This is parenthetical. It's because he had 7 daughters, and after each daughter was married off, he had to declare bankruptcy and change his name. That's why he had 7 names. But seriously speaking, he had 7 names. One of his names was Putiel, and the root of that word is to stuff. He stuffed calves, preparing them for slaughter for his pagan gods. So they insulted Pinchas by saying, you know your grandfather, you know who he was? He was a horrible person, and you're no different. You're no better. You took justice into your own hands, and you killed a prince in Israel. And therefore the Torah says, no, you should know that Pinchas was also the grandson of Aaron, son of Elazar, the son of Aaron. So the Rebbe explains this Rashi very beautifully. Pinchas was a zealot, and being a zealot seems to be a good thing, as the text indicates. That's only true if your zealousness is motivated by a devotion to God and love and passion for God and His ways. There are people who are essentially and inherently cruel, sadistic, nasty, horrible people who are looking for opportunities to do violence. They know they can't because they'll get arrested or their conscience bothers them. But if they get the license to do something that's violent, they will thrive on that violence. And that's what they were telling Pinchas. Pinchas, you're no saint, you're no zealot, you're just a bloodthirsty guy. And how could we prove this? Because it's in your genes. Your grandfather was a cruel, sadistic guy, stuffing calves, hurting them in the process of stuffing. And for what purpose? For slaughtering them to worship some pagan gods. That's an indication that he was a cruel man. They didn't mention that he was worshipped the idols, because ideology doesn't get transferred by heredity. You don't inherit your grandfather's ideology unless he educates you into it. But a trait, an emotional trait, a disposition, cruelty, that is something that can be transmitted through genetically. And therefore they were saying, you are genetically a descendant of this Putiel, you're a cruel guy, and you didn't do it because you wanted to serve God. So the Torah says, no. He was a grandson of Aaron. Aaron is known to be the most loving, the most passionate, the most peace-loving person that ever lived. Aaron is described in Ethics of the Fathers. He loved peace, he pursued peace, he loved everyone. So Aaron was the paragon of love and compassion and kindness. And therefore the Torah is saying you should know that Pinchas did what he did motivated by love for God and love for the Jewish people that he was saving by virtue of this very extreme act of zealousness. So Pinchas is a man of peace, essentially, notwithstanding the violence that we just read in last week's Parsha. This answers a question: why does the Torah split the story of Pinchas into 2 sections? Last week we read the first part of the story, and this week we're reading the second part of the story where God rewards him. Because the Torah wants to tell us there are 2 Pinchases. There's the Pinchas the zealot and Pinchas the man of peace. And it's interesting that Zohar says Pinchas and Elijah are the same person. Elijah was also a zealot, and one time he spoke ill of the Jewish people to God, and God says, no, I don't want to hear that. When you speak to me, I want to hear only positive things about them, and because you did this, in the future you will come to every bris, and you will testify before me that the Jewish people are a moral and God-loving people. So Pinchas and Eliyahu were both zealots, but their zealousness was motivated by love, and that's the only justification for someone to be a zealot. This is the beginning of the parsha. Then we read a rehash, very briefly, in verse 14, who the two people were whom he had killed. If you read last week's parsha, it doesn't say who they were. It just says a man from the children of Israel, and he brought this Midianite woman, and he killed them. It doesn't say who it was. Now the Torah is identifying them. The man he killed was called Zimri, son of Salu. He was the leader of the tribe of Shimon. And the woman who was killed, the Midianite woman, was Cosbi, the daughter of Tsur, one of the leaders of the Midianite nation. So there's a very cute interpretation here of the identity of this princess. She's identified as a Midianite. Her name is Cosbi. Her father's name is Tsur. What is the hint in that name? Everything the Torah tells us has to have meaning. Even a name. Why would we care what the name of that immoral woman was? Give her any name you want. Why is that relevant? So there's always deeper meanings, and this is one interesting hint the Chedushei Harim, the first Ger Rebbe, gave. There are three pillars upon which the world stands. The world can't exist without these three, as it says at the end of the first chapter of Ethics of the Fathers. The world stands on truth, justice, and peace. If you don't have truth, you don't have justice, you don't have peace, you have anarchy, you have corruption, and the world falls apart. You need those three things. This woman represented the antithesis of those three things, and it's hinted in her name and country from which she came. The word Midian in Hebrew, the root of that word is related to a word that means conflict, the opposite of peace, conflict. Madam is conflict in Hebrew. So the Midianite people represented conflict. They wanted to sow conflict in the Jewish people. And she, the Midianite woman, personified that conflict. Conflict amongst themselves, conflict between Jews and God, by causing them to be degraded by their immorality. That's one aspect of her. She's a Midianite. She's a woman of conflict that contradicts the ideal of shalom, of peace. The second thing is Cosbi. Cosbi, the root of that word, kozev, means falsehood. She represented falsehood. Anyone who was doing what she was doing, luring people, enticing people, was engaged in acts of deception and falsehood. That is the antithesis of the other pillar, which is truth. So that's her name, Cosbi. Her father's name was Tsur. Tsur means a rock, and there's a verse in Deuteronomy where God is described as the rock for whose all his acts are mishpat, are justice, are just. God is the source of justice, a rock of justice. There's an expression in the Talmud that courts have to really take the law into their hands. Yikov hadin esahar. The law has to pierce through a mountain. In other words, whatever the obstacles are, the law has to be implemented. It's the rock of Gibraltar. So, three words. The Midianite counters peace, Cosbi, falsehood, counters truth, and Tsur, the rock, counters justice. This, of course, she was the antithesis, and the whole event was trying to undermine the whole world by virtue of what they were doing. When, right after this, God says to Moses to smite the Midianites because of what they tried to do to the Jewish people. They allowed their daughters to entice the Jews so that they should worship the idol, Peor. What about the Moabites? Rashi asks. The Moabites were also involved. They also let their daughters loose to seduced the Jewish people and caused them to worship idols. Why weren't they destroyed the way God commanded the Midianites to be destroyed? So Rashi says, because of Ruth. Because the Moabites were the ancestors of Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite woman. And because of her, God spared that entire nation. That's how high regard we have for Ruth. But it's not just Ruth herself, it's Ruth and her descendants, because of course her great-grandson was none other than King David, who's the father of the Davidic dynasty, leading all the way to Mashiach. So Moab is the progenitor of Mashiach. So by not destroying Moab, God was allowing Mashiach to enter into this world. I just want to share something that the Kabbalists talk about, that when you look at Mashiach and his ancestry, there are a lot of very questionable things about his ancestry. First of all, he's a descendant of Yehuda and Tamar. Yehuda and Tamar had a relationship that was not exactly a kosher one, at least in appearances. It didn't look kosher. She posed as a harlot, and he had relations with her, and from that came the birth of Peretz, who was the ancestor of of King David. Ruth, on the other hand, comes from Moab. Moab was a product of Lot consorting with his daughter, a product of incest. Then, of course, the Moabite people were these horrible people who tried to curse the Jews and let loose their daughters to seduce them and cause them to be destroyed. So Ruth is a descendant of the whole nation of Moab. King David was considered to be an illegitimate child, and that's a long story which we'll leave for another time. And it was only later on that it was determined that he was not illegitimate, in addition to the fact that many people said that Ruth was not allowed to marry Boaz, King David's great-grandfather, because the Torah says you're not allowed to marry into the Moabite nation. But the distinction was made, marrying a woman Moabite was permissible, where marrying a man Moabite was not. That was not necessarily so clear in those days, and people accused him of not being quote-unquote kosher. So when we put all these things together, and King David had a relationship with Bathsheba, which was not exactly the most righteous and holy liaison, at least for appearance sake. So all of the children, the descendants of King David, come through so many different, very questionable relationships. So one of the explanations for that is, the Kabbalists give, that whenever a very powerful surge of positive divine energy comes into the world, it upsets the balance with the forces of evil that God allows to exist to give us a challenge. So there has to be equal time, so to speak, for the evil forces. But if you give equal time to the evil forces, this will be a stalemate, will be a draw forever. So what God has to do is to allow these very holy souls to come into the world in a way that the evil will not recognize that it is holy, because it comes through such sordid, different relationships. So the soul of Mashiach came into the world through a relationship of Lot and his daughter, Yehuda and Tamar, Ruth and Boaz, and coming from the Moabite people. After this whole story, God asked the Jews to be counted. Whenever Jews died in the desert, God wanted them to be counted. And the reason for that is because he cares for them, and he doesn't want to show that he just killed somebody. It doesn't bother him. He wanted to know how many Jews survived. Now it lists all the different families. When it comes to Reuven, this is in chapter 26, verse 5, Reuven's son, the oldest son, was Chanoch. And it's the family HaChanochi, the Chanochi family. But why does it have to say that? It's obvious. If the name of the father was Chanoch, then we know that his family is the Chanoch family. But yet they're called HaChanochi. So Rashi says, HaChanochi has a Hey at the beginning and a Yud at the end. That's God's name. Why is God's name attached to it? And the same thing with other families that come after this. They all begin with a Hey and end with a Yud, because the nations of the world were criticizing and embarrassing the Jews and saying, these Jews have genealogy. They lived in Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt. Obviously, their mothers were impregnated by Egyptians. They're not really descendants of Reuven and Shimon and Levi. So God says, I'm going to put my name on them, my imprimatur, to demonstrate that every one of them has my divine seal, and they are all kosher. So the question is asked by one of the commentaries, if people said that, they said it when the Jews were still in Egypt. So the Torah should have somehow dispelled that rumor right after the Exodus. Why did it wait to the 40th year in the desert to dispel that? And the answer given is, as long as the Jews themselves behaved in a reputable way, as long as there was no immorality amongst them, then we didn't really care for what the nations were saying. Number one, it was hard for them to say it because look how Jews were comporting themselves. And also, even if the nations were saying it, we don't have to defend ourselves every time an anti-Semite says something against us. But when we gave them some ammunition, when we behaved immorally, as we did in this case, where the Jews consorted with the daughters of Moab and Midian, now the charge of the nations has credibility, has credence. We see how badly they behave, so that brought back their argument that Jews were not really the products of Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, and so on. After it goes through the various tribes and their families, and it gives you the total count of the number of Jews, 601,730. Gives you an exact number, which is interesting because you would think that, the Torah would just give you a round figure. That's to show you that the Torah is very precise. Then it goes on to talking about the distribution and the division of the land. The Jews are now poised to go into the land of Israel, and they have to know where they're going to settle. And the instructions were given about how to divide the land. How should it be divided? With a go-roll. Go-roll is a lottery system. A lottery system that would have a name of a tribe, a name of a section of Israel. They picked up the name of the tribe, and they picked up the name of the part of Israel. That tribe got that portion. And our sages tell us something incredible. The words used in the Torah in chapter 26, verse 56, Al pi hagoro. It's translated based on the goro, but literally it means on the mouth of the goro, of the lottery. So Rashi quotes the Midrash. It says, the goro itself spoke, obviously miraculously. The goro spoke and said, so-and-so, this tribe gets this portion of the land. So not only did you read it and you'd see which tribe got which land, but the goro actually said it. And the Rebbe has a whole discourse on that. Why did God have to perform such a miracle? God does not perform miracles needlessly. Miracles to save people, to demonstrate God's power. But over here, there was, what's the point in the goro speaking? Well, last week we had the donkey speaking. That was a separate issue. But that's not what we're discussing today. But why would an inanimate object have to speak? And the Rebbe explains that it's to teach you a lesson, that when you do something holy, even if it's an accessory to something, here they're not doing something intrinsically important. The division of the land is what's important. This is a preliminary thing, preparing them for the division. You have to do it with every fiber of your being. You have to put your thought into it, your action for sure. The girdle was involved action, but also speech. Every part of your personality has to go into the process of conquering the land of Israel, which figuratively speaking is what we're supposed to be doing every day. We're supposed to be taking our environment outside of Israel and transforming it into an Israel. The Rebbe shared the story that he shared many times, that a chassid, a follower of the third Chabad Rebbe, known as the Tzemach Tzedek, came to him for a blessing on his journey to Israel. He wanted to make Aliyah. And the Tzemach Tzedek said to him, why do you go to Israel? Make Israel here. I know that doesn't sound like a Zionist approach, but that's the Chabad philosophy. Yes, Israel is a very holy place, and it's a great thing to live in Israel. It's the greatest luxury. But as long as we're in exile, and we're situated in exile, we have to make the most of it, knowing that the next second we might be, and we're hoping to be, in Israel. But while we're here, we have to be here in the sense that we're transforming it into Israel. The Midrash says that in the future Messianic age, all of the synagogues and all of the holy places of the diaspora will be brought into Israel. So when we create holy places here, it will become part of Israel. Moreover, it says that Israel will spread to the whole world. How is that going to work? It works by us doing it. It's not going to be an automatic process. We are doing it right now. Every time we do a mitzvah, living in whichever city we live in exile, we are transforming the place into Israel and preparing and paving the way for the ultimate redemption, when the whole world will be endowed with this spirit and holiness of Israel. After it goes through the various families, a story that is sometimes misinterpreted by feminists about the daughters of Tzlofchad. Tzlofchad died because of some sin that's not mentioned in the Torah, although the Talmud tries to identify what sin he was guilty of. How do we know he sinned? Because his daughter said so. He died without any sons. He had 5 daughters. Now, who was going to get land in Israel? Those people who got out of Egypt. They were the ones to whom the land of Israel was apportioned. Now that he died and he left no sons, and if only sons inherit, that means his portion would not go to his family. His portion would be lost from his family. So they came and complained to Moses, and they said, we want to have our father's share in Israel. True, we're girls, we're women, we don't have any brothers, but we want to have a share in the land of Israel. Moses was stumped, and he asked God what to tell them, and God says, they are right. They should inherit that. If there are no sons, the daughters inherit. Now, this is not the time and place to go into the laws of inheritance, why if there are sons, the daughters don't inherit. That doesn't mean they don't get anything. It's more complicated than that. But the law of inheritance essentially goes to the sons, but if there are no sons, the daughters get it. What was their complaint? Not equality. Not that they are entitled to the same land that their brothers would have been entitled to. That is not what that bothered them. They were not looking for equality, although there's nothing wrong with equality per se. That's not their quest. Their quest was they loved the land of Israel. They could not bear the fact that their family would not be connected to Israel. It was a love of Israel because it was God's land, not desire to be equal with men. Anytime you want to be equal with someone, that undermines the credibility of your demand. Your demand should be, I want something that is intrinsically valuable and important. I want something holy. I want a relationship with God. And therefore, I want to be connected to the land of Israel. That was their quest. And we find that the women were much more attached to the land of Israel even before this, when the spies who spoke up against Israel and the Jews cried because they didn't want to go into this land. Our sages tell us that the women did not participate in that rebellion because they loved the land of Israel. Now they mention our father died in the desert, and he was not amongst those who fought against God in this community of Korach. He sinned by his own personal sin. Why do they have to mention that he was not amongst the Korach community? Because Korach rebelled against Moses. So they wanted to impress upon Moses, our father was not a rebel. Our father did not try to revolt against you. At that point, commentaries say, that's when Moses says, I can't give you an answer. Why? Because I now have, you just bribed me. By telling me that your father was not a member of the rebellion against me, you're telling me that your father was my supporter. Oh, if he was my supporter, I'm not going to be objective anymore in deciding your fate. That's why he had to approach God. There's a story of one of the great Hasidic Rebbes, Rabbi Avram Bornstein, I think it was his name, known as the Sachachover Rebbe, and he was the rabbi of his community, and one of his congregants was needed to be had a court case with another Jew, and the rabbi would be the judge. And he's telling the rabbi that about a year or so earlier there was a dispute between the rabbi and the cantor, and the shochet, I don't remember which one, and he was fired. And he said, I was not on the cantor's side, implying that I was on your side. And the rabbi said, if that's the case, I can't be your judge. Just by telling me that you are on my side means that I am not going to be objective anymore, and therefore I have to recuse myself. And after this, there's a huge section dealing with the holidays. And one of the explanations why there's such a focus on the holidays here is because, and most of the sacrifices of the holidays, is because this is read during the 3 weeks when we grieve over the destruction of the temple, when we lost the ability to bring those sacrifices and celebrate the holiday in the fullest measure. So these 3 weeks precisely we read the laws about the various sacrifices of the holidays. Number one, to give us a little bit of a boost to pray for and anticipate the coming redemption, and also to bring a little joy, permissible joy, in this sad period of 3 weeks by focusing on the holidays. Since this is the 3-week period, the Rebbe instructed us to study the laws of the building of the temple. So we'll do one halacha, one law. The Rambam, Maimonides, has a section called Hilchos Beis Abchira, the laws of the chosen house. Now, he doesn't call it the laws of the Holy Temple, even though right after that, as he starts discussing it, he refers to it as the Migdash, the Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, but he calls it the chosen house, because, as Maimonides will make it clear, once the temple was built in Jerusalem, it was chosen for all times. There can never be another site. People say, why do we have to create problems with the Arabs? Temple Mount, they claim it's theirs, we claim it's ours. Let's buy a plot of land someplace else that no one contests, if there's such a thing, and build a magnificent temple there. Well, the answer is, if you do that, you're violating the Torah, because God chose that temple, just like he chose King David to be his selected monarch, and Mashiach is a descendant of King David who will restore the Davidic dynasty. Just like God chose the Jewish people, just like God chose the land of Israel, he chose that site for the temple. And once it was chosen, there's no other place where a person could come to bring sacrifices or to declare that to be the one and only holy temple. So it's Beis HaBchira, the chosen house. And it's our hope and prayer that we will see the rebuilding of the third temple imminently, with Mashiach spearheading the building of the temple. Have a good evening and a good Shabbos.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ended early tonight.
A little early.
Good. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I'm okay. How was everyone? How was your Shabbos? How was your son last week, Shabbos?